Hey folks, it's Nick. We're spending a lot of time this November talking about preparing your garden, what to plant, what not to plant, and a big component of that is cleaning up your garden, especially some of the summer stuff to make room for your winter crops and then also to help you prepare for an early spring. So we have chore videos coming out, we have what to plan videos coming out. So we saw an article from the Oregon State University website, OSU, is entitled, "Should I Wait to Clean Up the Garden in Order to Help Conserve Insects?" So in studio this week, we have a certified permaculture specialist, Brian Maisenbacher from earthgrowerllc.com. And this is a great question for you because this is kind of your world, permaculture, regenerative ag. And as we're going into how much to clean up, this is perfect. So if we are in also the business of growing food and taking care of pollinators, taking care of beneficial insects, and doing things the right way, in the regenerative way. And we're also mass cleaning up a bunch of stuff. By reading this article, it's kind of making us stop and think, should we take it all out or should we leave something behind for the pollinators?
I really enjoyed what it dug into about carpenter bees. It references that there's about 2,100 different types of bee species, and about 10% of those are carpenter bees. There's an environment that can be created for them in your garden. So when you're cleaning up, say, your carrots or your buckwheat or even trimming your roses, some of those stems act as a really great environment for them to overwinter in. Anything that's stems that are about 5 to 8 millimeters is what the study was saying, and that's really interesting information. And that's in alignment with regenerative practices of wanting to leave something behind in your garden.
If we're raking up leaves this time of year in particular, should we leave a pile of those somewhere for especially some of those decomposters to be in the ground, insulated a little bit, take care of their larvae? That's something that's going to come out in the spring. You know, if we're talking about overwintering plants, we're also overwintering the eggs that these bugs are going to hatch from and then do a lot of the work for us next spring.
Oh yeah, I mean there's a reason that the leaves fall from the tree and no one picks them up in the forest, right? And so I mean in a treed environment, absolutely you should leave every leaf on the ground. You probably shouldn't rake them if you're in like an orchard setting or a tree grove type setting. Leaving the leaves is really important. And gathering some of them for making compost pile can be really great. And when you're making a compost pile, not only are you making an environment for beneficial insects to come to that compost pile, but you're making a powerful microbial inoculant that you can put out in the spring.
What's your feeling on also creating a habitat with a lot of times you'll see those bee boxes where it's a wood frame and there's sticks and bamboo and other materials in there for them to nest in and use?
Oh, those are great. You can spread those around your property in various areas, and it's a really non-obtrusive way to create a beneficial environment for some of those insects, and I think that's a really positive thing to do.
And it's also one of those things where if we're taking a look and trying to balance out what's best for our pocketbook as farmers versus what's best for the environment and the biodiversity that we're trying to do, having something like a bee box that's off the ground, that's not using usable farm space, but still gives them a home to emerge from and to almost have a house or an apartment for themselves, you know, that I think that's what we're really trying to do is bridge the gap between we have to grow, we have to make money. We are inherently going to disturb some of that natural cycle, but if we're doing the type of farming that we want to be doing and it's creating possibly a bed that's just for them. One of the videos that we did this week, we talked about wildflowers. And so maybe just having a section of the garden dedicated to biodiversity, dedicated to the natural cycle of things that we're not tilling up, that we're not mass harvesting, that's just a native structure or a native, if we look for things that have stems, you know, it could be native grasses, it could be straws or hays or something that they can live in with that 8 to 6 millimeter stem section that you talked about.
One of the permaculture design principles when you're designing an environment is to value the marginal, right? Value the margins of your land, value the areas that tend to be overlooked. And those can be really great environments for beneficial hedgerows, places to create these beneficial environments for insects, for birds, as well as areas where you can create compost piles that can be act as an environment for some of them to overwinter in, and then actually reintroduce some of that stuff into the garden in the spring.
I like to think of hedgerows is a source for cutting materials, especially for like if you are incorporating cut stems or cut flower arrangements into market garden, which we're seeing more and more of that, but giving a place for like cedars or some type of evergreen. You know, some of these insects can harbor in. I know a lot of birds can be in there, but it also gives you something to trim back in order to go ahead and sell it to market as the greenery for some of these bouquets.
I've done that in the past. So the hedgerows are a really great source of wildflower bouquets to bring to market. Bouquets tend to sell really well at the market, and
High value crop.
it's a high value crop. It's not only acting as that habitat for the winter with the stems, it's bringing in the pollinators in the spring. And that tends to be really beneficial, especially with high value crops, things that need to be pollinated.
I know we're talking about creating habitats, but it just reminds me that this is also an opportunity to give you something to talk about on your local social media, and that we're farm foraging, you know, from our habitat. This is why we take care of pollinators. This is why we're taking care of the dung beetles and the earthworms and how all of that we're working together. But it's also giving us something to cut and bring to you to decorate your home and to make it, to bring a smile to your face kind of thing, while at the same time, you know, adding valuable dollars to the pocketbook that you're not having to cultivate all the time, and it's just there, and it's acting as a windbreak. So it's doing all of these things together, and especially protecting what we're talking about. What about the butterflies? That it did mention in the study, it's not such a concern because this does tend to be a migratory type of insect.
Yeah, so for butterflies, in terms of creating an environment for them to overwinter in, they tend to go to warmer environments in the winter anyway. They have a migratory pattern that goes all the way down into Mexico and into when you are in their path, the migratory path of, say, monarch butterflies, you can plant milkweed, you can create environments for them, and there's whole databases of what type of milkweed do I need to plant where I live, right? And a lot of the time, there's so much grant money around preserving the monarch that they'll send you plants or seeds for free to do that. And so creating those environments when they are in your area so that they have a food source more than a place to host them is important. They will host in the milkweed, and they'll reproduce in the milkweed, and they'll eat the milkweed. But that tends to be something that's happening more when they're there, not for them to stay there, because they're going to migrate.
Let's talk about indications of where this would be a good place to put on your farm. And I'm thinking about natural erosion spots. Like if you have something with a more of a slope that it's going to be hard to plant, it's going to be hard to cultivate, but you don't want that runoff eventually eroding into your crops. Planting something like native grasses and native wildflowers that you know you're never going to disturb, it gives you that habitat, gives you the protection while giving you a buffer to where your crops are going to be growing.
Oh, absolutely. If you're looking to prevent erosion, you want to look for things that have a pretty aggressive root system. They're going to hold things together. And some of the grasses are going to do that. Ryegrass has it's an annual grass, but it has quite a big root system. So what I like to do when I'm dealing with erosion, getting in something like ryegrass is going to produce a root system that stays, and then you can mow that down as mulch, and then you replant. And in those hedgerows, you tend to want to let things go to seed and let them get to the point where they dry out and go to seed, and then you can weed eat it down, or you can mow it down, and you're mulching and seeding at the same time. And when the rains come, or if it doesn't rain in your area, when you water it, all of that stuff will come up again. And you don't tend to need to put out a lot more new seed if you use that method, but you always need to put some, especially when you're establishing it.
And on these marginal places that you mentioned a second ago, I'm thinking elderberry, blackberry, raspberry, something that's, again, going to protect the soil from eroding away, gives you a little bit of that wind barrier, but now you're able to actually pull the fruit, which, if you get a thornless one, it might be a little bit better, but you're getting that high value crop that a lot of people are super into. The berries are historically a high seller, elderberries in particular, from, if people are into that kind of thing, that's a big market draw.
Oh, absolutely. And the elderberries and those stalked plants, like we were talking about before, they have the right kind of stalks, and when they're trimmed, they act as an environment for carpenter bees and some of these beneficial insects. And when you think of the overall soil food web, you're going to want to harvest some of that stuff, but that also is a food source for local wildlife. Even rodents eat insects, birds eat rodents, so these things that seem like a nuisance are a food source for something, and you really do want to have them all present. If you have a farm that doesn't have rodents and doesn't have birds and doesn't have some wildlife, you really want to question some of the other areas of your soil food web, because there should be rodents because there should be insects for them to eat, and there should be rodents because the birds are going to eat those, and so on, right? And having food sources for some of these characters that lay within the soil food web that you might not see value in is value to someone else, right? And it's looking at that bigger picture and creating some of these environments really can be beneficial to that. And not having rodents in place likely means that you have a lot more insects than you would like. And so we tend to think that they're a nuisance because the rodents can also eat your plants. But if there's enough insects and there's that balance there, that's what we're looking for, and that's where these environments really become important.
Which brings me to, if we're going to take the time to establish habitats for the pollinators and the earthworms, we might also want to consider throwing up a few birdhouses here and there. Purple martins can eat the mosquitoes. Other types of birds would eat the rodents, like an owl box or something like that.
Oh, absolutely. And generally speaking, a good farm usually has a cat, as well, to keep some of that balance in place. And a dog to keep away some of the larger mammals from coming onto your farm, So all of these different pieces, they act as part of that soil food web, and we're part of that as well. We have the benefit of being able to see all of it and orchestrate some of it and to put certain things in place so that we can navigate it.
And I guess this could go into, the opportunity to even put beehives on property.
Oh, yeah.
And look, even if you don't want to manage that or don't want to deal with the bees, you could work with other bee people in your area. I've seen that a lot where, a dedicated beekeeper will come in and put their boxes on other farms, and maybe there's a trade-off. Maybe you get a certain percentage of the honey or something like that. But you don't have to do it all, but you do have the option at least to provide a space for somebody else to come in and manage that for you. So let's look at the downsides. Sometimes not cleaning it up thoroughly may lead to increase in disease pressure, especially within plant-transmitted diseases, maybe some funguses. And if you're the type of farm that has an agritourism component, or that's just your mindset, if you want everything super clean, how are we to balance out what's best for our crop rows and where we're going to grow the crops, and the general appeal that you want to have a night, like especially if you're into marketing and sharing your farm story, but you don't necessarily want to have a mess all the time and have those little pockets of messes. How are you going to navigate that?
Things like powdery mildew, those can vector in pretty low temperatures and show back up next season. So you don't necessarily want to be putting down material that has powdery mildew in it. If there is powdery mildew, or if it's very minor, you can address it using biologicals and then incorporate that material. So one thing that I tend to like to do is, say I'm like mowing down a field. So a lot of the time when depending on what crop it is, rather than going through and ripping out all the weeds or tilling it or disking it, I like to mow the field. And mow it where I'm going to leave some of the stem material there, and then I'm going to mulch a lot of the leaf material around it. And the earthworms are going to consume a lot of that. That's going to become mulch that in general is going to be beneficial. But after I've done that, I like to go over it with a sprayer full of a biological liquid, compost extract, lactobacillus. There's a number of different things you could use depending on what it is. But when you're dealing with pathogens, something heavy duty like EM1 or a lactobacillus-based type product, or something like a prebiotic like a Ultra or something like that could be quite good to coat that material that you've put down to make it so that the surface material of it has so much beneficial biology and food for biology that's beneficial that a lot of those diseases won't be able to vector, and that it'll actually compost faster.
So I think the natural conclusion we can come to is look for opportunities within your farm's practice, whether that is in the marginal areas or dedicating a space in the middle, using the hedgerows, finding a way to pull multiple streams of income off of those hedgerows throughout the course of the year, and just letting that be a part of your farm story. And, you know, maybe not get so aggressive with the cleanup, especially in that area, to bring those insects back and let them live their full life cycle of the insect was born, it ate, it did a job for you, it took care of something on the farm, it reproduced, it laid eggs, and it's going to happen again and again. And they know that they have a safe place to go to.
Oh, absolutely. And another core part of that is when you're doing agritourism, a lot of people come because they want to see something beautiful and they want to get something to eat. But there's a whole other aspect of agritourism. There's people that want to come learn something, and a lot of the time having these kinds of like an interactive lab of sorts can encourage really high quality consultants to come out and host workshops. Now people are paying even more to come to your space because it's quote unquote not pretty.
And you can probably bring people in mass, like, hey school, this is the flat fee to bring this many students out, or hey Master Gardener thing, you can come do this for free, but maybe you have a dinner that's paid or something like that. But having reasons for people to come back out, just like having a space for bugs to come back out, it's doing all the work for you. It's doing that regenerative ag that I know such a huge component for people, but it's also bringing in income streams. Thanks for this one. Folks, again, go ahead and like and subscribe. Any comment below that you have that you've personally done at your place, whether it's put out a bird bath or a bird feeder or a bee box or something like that. If you're working with a honey purveyor in your area, we would love to hear how that's working and what those terms are. And that way it kind of gives other farmers and growers an opportunity to see what's going on elsewhere and maybe start a dialogue down below. So thanks again. We're recording a lot with Brian this week, so take a look for that, and we'll see you in the next one.
Can you say the line?
You like jazz?